Hey there, I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. So today we're going to be working on some lightning out over the ocean, and we're going to begin in the background here. I'm going to start with a round pointed brush. The one I have here is about 1/4 of an inch, and I'm going to begin with this because it has a nice sharp point which will help me with detail work, and it also has a soft edge which will be fantastic for getting some really nice smooth transitions between our clouds. Now before I grab any paint, I'm actually going to dip the bottom third of my brush here in some water and wipe off the excess on the edge. I'm doing this because that extra moisture in the bristles will help us keep our paint wet for a significantly longer period of time, and it'll help us create some smooth blends on the canvas. So let's grab some paint. So now I'm going to take a good amount of titanium white, about half that of Mars black, and I'm taking off the excess over here just because it's a very strong pigment. Then I'll grab about a similar amount of French ultramarine blue to that of the titanium white I added, and I'll also grab a hint of brilliant purple as well. So I'll mix that up until we have a fairly even mixture. Then I'm going to test it quickly on my reference photo, just make sure my color's right, and it looks like it could actually be slightly more saturated. So I'll add a little bit of extra French ultramarine blue, a little bit of brilliant purple, work those in together, like that a lot. And now I'm going to go right in between these two larger clouds and start painting in our sky. Now I like to begin in the background whenever I paint because I like to layer my midground and foreground layers on top. It just makes the painting process a little bit easier. So I'm going to start by grabbing this. I'll work it very lightly around this little streak of lightning that we have. And I like to always begin by kind of mapping out all of my edges first, and then once they're done, I'll mix a bit more paint, Mars black, titanium white, French ultramarine blue, brilliant purple. Mix up a good portion of that. Make sure that it's well mixed, that way you don't have little splotches of white or blue or purple, because if it isn't mixed well here, it won't be mixed well on your brush and you'll get random applications that you aren't entirely pleased with. But once I have that larger mixture, now I can come back in and just kind of fill this area in. I'm also going over areas we previously applied paint to, because acrylics are innately semi-transparent, and generally you will see the canvas through your initial layer, especially if you're working with water or a medium that thins it. So it's good to go back in and just make sure that it's nice and thick. So as you can see, I just started moving that down a little bit farther, but I wanted to get you a lot closer because if you look right up here in these different areas, you can see that the paint is a little bit thin and you can see the white of the canvas showing through. Again, very easy to kind of remedy. You just let it dry, you go back in, you add another layer. But I mention it because I think a lot of people, when they see that sort of thing, they think that they just have a lot of brush strokes in their canvas that they need to work out. And quite often, it's really just that you need more layering. It's not that you're painting with a particularly poor technique. So, just something to consider. With that said, I'm going to start moving down this right here with that same pigment. Again, I like to work my edges first because it just makes sense, because you have the most paint, the most clean, sharp applications when you first grab new paint. And then as it starts to run out, you get this more gritty look, right? You get this more toothy look. So we try, at least initially, to get those edges while we have a lot of paint and sharp applications. Now I'm going to start moving into the middle of the canvas, but before I do that, now that we've essentially outlined our first cloud, we can move in there. So I'm going to make a darker mixture, and I'm going to do it right beside this one because that will essentially give us a blueprint for what we're working beside in the actual painting. So it's kind of like a cheat sheet, and it'll make sure that things are cohesive in the mixing process. So here you can see I am mixing quite a bit of a darker bluish gray, and yet again I think I'm just going to test that quickly on my reference photo. I made mine slightly darker, so I will just readjust, add some extra titanium white. There we go. You can see that there isn't too much of a difference, but it's enough that one will stand out next to the other. So yet again, I'm going to go over my edges. I'm going to use the fine, sharp tip of the brush to work a lot of that edging. And then once I feel like I'm starting to run out of paint, I'm just going to use the body of the brush, apply more pressure, and fill in the middle area. Now when I'm doing this, I am avoiding the edges because again, I don't have a lot of control. I don't have that sharp tip loaded up with paint. So right now we're just using the excess to start building a base layer for our first cloud. Now, something I try to talk about in every lesson is the acceptance of kind of awkward stages of acrylic paintings. Because there's so much layering involved in acrylics, generally there are a lot of layers that look unfinished and therefore not fantastic, but I would urge you to keep painting, to continue with the process, because generally, again, it's not that you're doing anything wrong, it's just that the painting requires more layers. And we can apply them if we're patient. Here I'm remixing more of that initial pigment. I'm trying to keep a little bit of it on the edge, that way I can see what I'm mixing towards and how close I am. And that looks like it right there. So, we don't normally start in the middle. Remember, we like to start on the edges, the outskirts. Paint that in like that. And now we'll use the body, press with some additional pressure. And by the way, when we're working the edges, we are applying as little pressure as possible with the brush. You essentially just want the paint on the end of the tip of the brush to touch the canvas. You don't want the bristles to actually rub into them. So now we have a base layer. You can see lots of little areas where the paint is thin, and you can see the canvas through that. Again, not a problem. Just means we need to go back and do another layer. I will, however, now take this and move over to this side. Start on my edges. Start filling these in. And something we did here that will change is that we did the edges with a hard stroke. So we used the point of the brush, we got this really nice sharp line, but that isn't always what you want. Sometimes you want it to kind of fade off into the rest of the sky. So here, with an incredibly light touch, I'm going over the edge of this cloud, and I'm just dragging it out into that previous pigment. Even if it's dry, this will still work. It's kind of a wet into dry technique, and the paint essentially dissipates atop the previously applied dry layer of paint, and it creates this semi-transparent transition and gradient. So it just looks softer, it gives the cloud a bit of movement, and you get some different edging as well, which makes the piece more diverse. Now, I'm going to actually wait for this and this to dry, then we'll come back in, do a second layer, and start cleaning it up, adding some detail, all of that good stuff. So our paint here is just about dry, and that means we can go back and start applying another layer. Now, I know generally with painting tutorials, people like to know what's next. They like to move on to the next subject. They like to, okay, that's done, now to this. And that's something that I used to really put a lot of emphasis on, was continuously moving, keeping the lessons kind of frenetic. But I just feel like I've personally improved significantly as a painter by continuously going back and doing the second, the third layer, doing the same thing over and over again. And so while I recognize it isn't visually the most captivating thing, I think that it teaches a really important lesson, and that lesson is for those of you who are, interested in taking the time, watching the entirety of it, okay with watching the same thing being painted with a thick layer right after. I think that's going to be really beneficial to the community as a whole. So, yes, again, awkward stage. We're going to work through it. We're not just going to kind of say, okay, let's move on to the next bit. Going to put that time and effort in. With that said, while I'm doing this, you can see just a dramatic difference between the first and the second layer with really the same color. But another thing I'd like to note is that I'm not dragging the paint out incredibly far. The more you drag your paint, the thinner it gets, and it kind of defeats the purpose of going back in with additional layers. So there, as you can see, once I've essentially applied the paint, I don't try to drag it far at all. I just kind of go back to my palette and I'll either mix more or grab more. And I don't mix a massive amount of paint at any real point, just because I think there's a lot of value in remixing your paints. You can learn a lot through that process. It kind of allows you to memorize different palettes and mixtures, so when you want to go in and paint it next time, you know what to do. A month, 2 months from now, you say, okay, you know what? I did this probably 25 times in that painting. I've got it. I've held on to it. I don't have to go back and revisit it. So, with that said, that is one base layer done. Let's now start having some fun with it and adding some detail. So let's get right up close. I'm now switching to another round pointed brush. This one, however, is about 1/8 of an inch, and this is the current mixture we have. I'm going to take a little bit of it. I'm going to move it over there. I'm going to take some extra titanium white, a little bit of extra brilliant purple, extra French ultramarine blue, mix those together, and I'm actually going to take my pinky finger, brace it on the canvas so I take shake out of my hand. I'm going to come in here about 1 centimeter. I'm going to start creating this sharp edge, and I want the bottom edge of the stroke to be sharp. So if you're placing your brush on the canvas, try to make sure that the point is facing the bottom area. And then I'm going to let it dissipate as we get to here. So you can see that it's a sharp line, and then it becomes less and less opaque as you move to this point. Now I'm going to take the extra paint off my brush, going to come back, and I'm going to blend that stroke back into the rest of our cloud. And I'm going to do so by moving upwards. And you can also move your brush in a little bit of a circular stroke to get a nice soft cloud-like aesthetic. But this is going to create some depth. It's going to make it look like there is some added light in between this cloud and this cloud. It gives us an additional subject. So in a number of ways, it just really adds to the painting. We'll grab a bit more. We'll skip a little break right there. Just checking on the reference photo. Here looks good. And then I'll do that yet again. This time, however, I'm blending down. Just like that. Might even make the edges here a little bit brighter. That way they'll blend slightly more with the actual sky and backdrop. You can go back in around those edges and really brighten things up, but try to keep it a little bit inconsistent. Have it brighter maybe here, have darker areas, because that's what's really going to make it interesting. There we go. Now I do want to go back and touch this up, but I'm going to do so with the larger brush, and I'm going to create a slightly different mixture than the dark blue that we have. So I'll add in just a hint of our purple, and I'm just going to almost randomly move this throughout the darker areas. That way we have slight highlights of the purple from the sky reflecting back onto the cloud. And that way it doesn't look flat. So you now have multiple values and hues happening within this area. And they aren't dramatically different, and that's why I wanted to show you this from afar, just so you didn't get caught up in any slight changes and mistake them for larger ones. When it is farther away, it's easier to tell what's cohesive and what isn't. So here you can see that we're just throwing in a little bit of extra color on the purple side here and there, and diversifying the larger base layer. With that, I really want to work on this cloud before we kind of touch that up, because I want to work on them kind of in unison. That way we can make sure that they are working together and they feel like they exist in the same sky and piece. But to do this, remember first, we need to work all the way around this outline. That way we can do that, because we work the background initially. So I'll mix more of the pigment for our background. Blue, pink, well, purple, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black. And I think I might actually make this slightly more purple than what we previously had. Here we have the initial color for the sky. Let's give this a try. Work it back into this. So far, so good. Going to try to avoid the lightning, but if I go over it, that is okay. It's fairly easy to redraw back in. Remember, we go over the edges first. We try to use the tip of our brush for edging, and then when we run out of paint, well, then we can just use the body of the brush and work it this way. Here you can see I'm working it into the other previously bluish purple. And it's important to note that the majority of the sky is going to be this bluish purple that's, fairly similar, but you also want it to be kind of ever-changing. So going from one to the other, making your mix slightly different, that is going to be advantageous, as it's going to make the piece more captivating in the end. It's also going to be brightest, the sky that is, at the top, through the body of the lightning, bottom left-hand corner and bottom, so the middle is going to be a bit darker with the exception of right around the lightning. So as I start to move down this cloud here, you might want to take a little bit of your darker cloud mixture and work that in. Once we have a generally decent base, we're going to mix more for that area. However, I'm going to do so with a 1-inch large flat-headed brush, just because I can apply a lot of paint very, very quickly, and these sharp edges will allow me to cut around sharp areas. So we'll start with some Mars black, quite a bit of our French ultramarine blue, titanium white, getting there, purple, brilliant purple to be precise. And if you don't have brilliant purple, you can mix a nice purple with French ultramarine blue and either a cad red or a primary red. Here we're just creating more of that cloud color that we had before. You can see I'm just testing it. Then once we have it, we'll start working this along those edges. I'm using the corner of the brush to deliver my sharp edges, by the way. You might also want to hold your brush like this, as opposed to like a pencil. It'll give you a much more loose stroke. It'll be harder to control, but it'll take out any subconscious consistencies that you have that kind of create unnatural repetitions. All of us have them. And if you're aware of them, you can work around them, but if you're not aware of them, this is a very easy way of dealing with it. And this is a great technique to employ when really working on anything in nature that you have to do a lot of, like that of trees or mountains. There we go. Trying to go over a lot of this with a very smooth touch, because the more pressure you add, the more brush strokes you create, and we really don't want to create a lot of brush strokes. This is our first layer, we will be going over it, but in general. It's also important that you create some darker and some lighter areas of the cloud. So I'm actually going to make this area a bit darker, and I'm going to make this area a bit darker. And how do you distinguish what generally is going to be darker or brighter? It's simply a question of what area of the cloud is most dense. What area of the cloud is it going to be harder for light to move through? Now this area of the cloud, it progressively gets bigger this way, and as it gets bigger, it's harder for light to move through it. So this area makes sense that it's darker, and the reference photo attests to that. This area is also quite dense. We have a bit of a thinning area in the cloud right through here, so we keep that a bit brighter. But in these darker areas, I'm using a mixture of Mars Black and everything we were previously applying. But it's an easy way of just building up some extra depth. You can also take that and work it on the back of this cloud, because again, it's getting more dense as you move this way, it's thinning out as you move towards the right. Now this is dried for the most part, so I am going to make sure my brush is damp. It'll help me create a bit of a wet into dry blend, where again, initially it's fairly opaque, but the farther you move out that paint, especially with water, the more transparent it gets, the more you see those underlayers through it. And you essentially get a blend without having two wet pigments. You can also add a little bit here in the back, and then have it, again, lessen. Just adding some extra water to my brush, taking off that paint. That way I can do this blend really simply. And now because we have a high contrast between these two, that stands out a bit more and it looks quite nice. Again, this is one of those paintings where you really need to accept that it's not going to look great for at least the first half of the process, and you just need to trust the process. Some paintings, you kind of have different ratios. Sometimes, 20% in, it starts to look great. Sometimes it's, 80% in, and then it starts to look great. And I think it's just one of those great lessons that really teaches you to trust yourself, your techniques, your process, and especially the layering process. If you've ever struggled with layering with acrylics and knowing how much to do, this is a great lesson to really spend time on. With that said, I actually missed a little spot here in the sky, so I'm going to switch back to the round pointed brush. Going to make a brighter version of that. I can see the initial sky color right there. Did leave a hint of that, and I do try to leave a hint of most of my colors on my palette for scenarios like this, should I need to return to colors. But I think I will make this one a bit darker. So I'll grab some of that cloud color, and we'll apply that right in here. Now, we've also had defined edges for the majority, except for right here where it did get a little bit of loose application, but you can actually blend the sky into the clouds in some areas, and I'm going to do that right here. Now we are going to get some of that canvas showing through. We are going to see some of those brush strokes. That is okay. We're just going to trust the process and bring that out, bring that up here. So far, so good. Remember, we only did one layer for this portion of the sky, so we'll have to go back and do that anyway. You can also move all the way around the edges of your clouds if you want a softer look. And I'm just using a very minimal amount of pressure and kind of working in a bit of a circular motion. There we go. Really nice. So here I wanted to get really close and essentially just show you the difference between 2 layers of paint and 1 layer of paint. Also, a 3rd or a 4th layer will make this look significantly better as well. So just a friendly reminder, with that said, I'm going to let that dry and then we'll come back in with our 2nd layer. So now that my pigments have fully dried, I'm going to take that 1-inch large flat-headed brush. I'm going to mix up a bit of that darker pigment yet again, and generally, because we have to wait for these pigments to dry, the pigment on our palette that we've mixed does also dry, so we have to go back and mix more, which, again, I don't think is a bad thing because I think it just makes you much better at color mixing at a much more quick rate. So here, as you can see, I made a mixture, I went in and I tried to apply it, and guess what? It was a little bit too bright. So I'm actually going to use this just for the sky here. And then I'm going to take some extra Mars Black and work that back into the middle. And here, right up there, you can see that that transitions really nicely. So I know that we found the right pigment. Again, I'm going over this with very soft blends, very soft strokes to make sure that it is being applied without much of a brush stroke. Just crafting the larger, more dense area of this cloud. Continuously taking off paint. That way I can go back in fresh. And in the process, you can kind of create interesting other little clouds as well. But right now I'm happy with that, and I want to work with it while it's still a little bit wet. So I'm going to mix a new pigment. This is going to be a bit of a medium blue. It's going to be darker than what we have up here, but it's going to be lighter than what we have over here. So I'm mixing it in between the two of them. I will add a little bit of our purple, just so it fits in with the rest of the painting and landscape. So we're making it slightly darker, and we're almost there. I think I'll test it on my reference photo really quickly. Also, if you struggle with color mixing, I highly recommend starting to work with reference photos. Can just make things a lot easier to physically test. I saw that it needed to be a little bit brighter, needed a bit more blue, heavy saturation. So, let's start around our lightning. And I'm going to go over the majority of my lightning, admittedly, but I want to keep the general placements. So I'll leave just the hint of a mark, of a line, going over those edges first. And I'm doing both sides of the lightning, because if we were to only do one side, and then let's say we got distracted, and then we went back in to do the other, there's a chance this might be slightly off from that, and you really don't want that. You want these portions of the cloud to connect really well, of the sky to connect really well. Really, you don't actually see any sky. You see dark clouds, and then these are all clouds in behind. But we'll call it a sky just for simplicity's sake. Now we want to mix this into that. So we'll get some purple, some white, create another mixture right up here that we think will be quite similar. It's a little bit darker. Let's add more titanium white. There we go. Perfect. And you know what? I think we'll just do a little bit more of that around here. Work that up here. And then down into our blue. So now we have another layer on our sky. Just making it even more thick. And I'm going to move this purple slightly up around to this cloud, and then I'll blend it out into the sky with a wet into dry technique like we've talked about. Do have a little bit of paint there on my brush. We'll just get that off. Maybe grab some more blue. Give it another layer. This area is all being illuminated to a much greater degree because of the lightning. I'll also take a little bit of that dark pigment, a little bit of our light pigment, create a slight shadow color for another cloud. You can see it's just a slightly darker version of that. And I'm going to create a cloud that essentially comes off here. I'm letting this be quite loose. I'll switch to holding my brush like this. It's incredibly subtle in the reference photo, so that's what I'm aiming for here. I don't want defined edges. I don't want a stark application. I just want a soft, middle of the road cloud like that. That was my water bottle. Nothing to worry about. Anyways, we do need to blend these in a little bit better. The paint's still wet. Soft strokes. Grab that. Blend the purple into the blue. We'll blend this back. There we go. Starting to get some really interesting colors and blends. I do think, though, that I want this to be a bit more purple up here. So it's brighter, closer to the cloud. It gets darker as you move to the top, but not by too much. And you can see that this cloud right here, it's very soft edgewise, while this one is very hard. This one's kind of a mixture of the two. Now I'll start applying another layer over the sky here. And you might want to go over your drawing of the lightning very softly, so you can still see little portions because the paint is semi-transparent when you only go over it once or twice. But this will essentially mean that this area connects to that area connects to that area, and it just keeps it really nice and cohesive. Again, the lightning is the last thing we'll add, and we can redraw it if we need to. With that said, let's move a little bit farther down in our canvas and keep working on it. So now we're actually going to mix more of the blue that we have right here, and I'll mix it on top of / beside that mixture. That way I know that what we get will be very similar, if not the same. So I start with a lot of blue, some titanium white, everything I remember. And you know what? I think we actually may have gotten it on our first try, which doesn't always happen, but it's really nice when it does. And it happens more and more frequently the more you go back and remix your paints. And whenever I'm not sure, I ask myself a couple of questions. Is it too saturated? Is it not saturated enough? Is it too light? If so, add Mars Black. Is it too dark? If so, add titanium white. And then if it's not saturated enough, then you add more of the natural pigment, like a blue or a red or whatever it may be. And if it's too saturated, then you add more Mars Black and titanium white in equal mixtures. So pretty simple once you get in the habit of it. Though, admittedly, initially, not the easiest thing for everyone. I know it was one of those things that took me a lot longer than really everything else. I felt like when I started painting, I picked up on the application, I picked up on layering, I picked up on all of these different things. But color was kind of the last thing that kind of made sense. So I recognize while there's that kind of cheat sheet of questions, it doesn't initially click and it does take a little while. Just a little while of practice, really. With that, as I move over here, it's going to get darker. That cloud is going to extend a little bit, not to a great extent, and I do want it to be softer, so I'll mix off to the side of that initial darker area, make something slightly brighter, slightly more gray. Just tested on my reference photo. Got really lucky with that one too. I know that there is a bit of a lightning strike right here, so I'll try to leave the edges, general areas. We'll do a slight blend up very softly into this, which is still a little wet, but not enough so that I have a true blend. So it is a bit of a wet into dry application right there. And then I'll start applying it right underneath, all the way down here. Start bringing it into the main blue. Now, it's also worth noting that our levels of clouds here are quite complicated in that we have a lot of different types of clouds and we have different colors for the sky. You don't have to do that. You can go in with just a blue sky and make this significantly easier on yourself if you find that you're getting frustrated. But again, it's a great lesson if you do want to put in the time in just kind of learning about mixing in colors, because there are a lot of subtleties in it. Well, it's not a hyper complicated image. There is a lot that's visually going on in a subtle way. But if you just want a pretty picture of lightning, we can achieve that too, much more simply by just sticking with a single color for the background. And deciding on either soft or hard clouds. And don't feel bad if you do decide to go that route, We're not always ready for a more complicated lesson, and there is a very easy way of ending up with something quite pretty and similar. So here I'm just kind of extending this cloud, making it darker, just giving the painting a slight vignette effect. There we go. Let's make more of our blue. See, it didn't come that easy this time. I look at that, and I look at that color, and I ask myself, what's different about it? Well, I say this, it's a little bit less saturated. You don't have that real blue pushing through. So, okay, you know what? We'll add some blue. See if that fixes it. And you know what? That was it. That was really all we needed to do. Now this matches that, and we can continue working around our lightning. As I go back and remix colors, we'll do that exercise a couple more times. Sometimes it's a bit more complicated, sometimes it's quite easy. Okay. Now, I'm at the point where I almost have no paint, as you can see. And again, that's the point where I say stop trying to drag it out farther. Just smooth out what you have and then go back and grab more paint. Because once it's at that point and you're dragging from there, you're really just hindering your pigment and making it so you'll have to go back and do layer after layer after layer. And making them inconsistent as well, because it's really hard to get a soft blend when you don't have much paint on your brush. Again, we're mixing more. And hypothetically, could we mix just a massive amount of this color because we know we need a massive amount of it? Yes, but you get a lot better at color mixing by not doing that. So here we have our new mixture. It's right beside our old mixture. And what do I think of it? I think that it's actually slightly more saturated than what we have there, just by a hint. So I'm going to take some titanium white, some Mars black, just a tiny corner bit. I'll mix those, and that is just about it. So, with this, now I'll head over here. I'm going to work my way around some small drawn-in clouds we have. Now here we have a bit of a hard edge, right? It's much brighter. This is much darker. We'll need to come back in with a transitionary color, and we will do that in just a minute. Right now, however, while I have this pigment, I'm going to take it. I'm going to blend right over into here. Now remember that lightning is light, so this might be a little bit brighter. That's not a bad thing at all. Okay. So we have a good application. Smoothing it out, applying almost no pressure with my brush. Now I'm going to come back up in here and start making a transition. Let's get a little bit closer for that though. While we're here, I would like to acknowledge that the painting yet again is getting to yet another more messy point, and that's okay. I felt like we started cleaning it up, we started adding these layers, it started to look a bit more presentable, but then the following steps kind of took it in the other direction, and that's alright. Here I'm mixing up a bluish purple, so something that's a combination of what we have here and what we have here. You can see that it transitions fairly well into the purple. You can see that it's transitioning fairly well into the blue. And while we did apply clouds here, we can always do them again. I think I'd like to work over them to just make this transition a little easier. That way I can make wider strokes like this to transfer pigment a greater distance, and therefore just make a softer transition in the end. And now we're just working that back into our blue. The more we do this, the better it'll look. Now I am at the point where it's getting chalky. You can see that canvas tooth. So let's go back, grab more pigment. I grabbed a bit of this and a bit of that for the transition area. And now I'll grab more of for here. It did get diluted in the process, so I'll have to mix up a bit more. You can see that that's quite desaturated. So I'll add some extra purple, some extra blue, make it more lively again. Test it there. It's a little bit more purple than what we had, but I actually want this bottom left corner to be more purple, so I'm very happy with that. We'll just do a nice blend into what we just established. And this will be slightly darker because we have a cloud kind of in the distance softer right there. Now we do have lightning right here, and this is going to be quite bright, so I'm going to continue moving my purple down into this area. I'll have it blend up into our blue, and then for the actual lightning we're going to mix a brighter purple to really show off the light it renders. So I'll take some extra titanium white, work that into our mixture. I'm going to repaint the lightning later on. I'm going to redraw it later on. But I'm just going to mark with light where it's going to be. Just like that. We'll do a soft blend up here as it reflects into the other clouds in the sky. Grab some of our blue from there for this transition. So far, so good. Also going to make a slightly darker purple. So I'll go on top of a slightly darker purple that we previously had. Say, okay, you know, that's a little bit too gray. Let's give it some extra saturation with some extra blue and purple. There we go. That looks nice. And I'll use that for this corner over here, which again will add a bit of a vignette effect. and it'll make this highlighted area stand out significantly more because it has this dark contrast. I'll also use a hint of it over here because that lightning and that purple is going to then reflect out over into the blue, which is good. It's another transitionary area. Notice how I did leave that a bit more rough initially to go and work on the other areas. Sometimes you do need to do that just to make sure things are working in a timely manner. Sometimes you do it to get extra paint off your brush. And now we'll just soften that. So now we're going to take some of our white, some of our blue, a little bit of purple, mix up a much brighter bluish purple than what we've used before. We're only going to have the smallest hint of Mars Black in it. We're going to head down to our horizon line. With a series of strokes, mirror that horizon line, and I do this with a series of them rather than a single one because generally when you make a single stroke, you get a bit of an arch, a curve in one way or another. We don't want that here. Then I'm going to start moving that pigment up. We want it to be nice and thick, so I'm not going to move it farther to the point that I don't feel like I will have a thick application, at which point I will go back and just grab more paint. And here, we're just creating the light from the bottom of the lightning strike. We do need to blend this into those areas. So we'll grab some extra Mars Black, make this more similar to what we were previously working with. Needs to be a bit more blue, needs to be slightly brighter. Still needs to be more blue. Trial and error will get you there. There we go. And now we're just going to kind of soften all of these blends and make them nice and clean. As you do this, you will be moving darker pigments over into those lighter pigments, which will darken them, dilute them a little bit. That is okay. Don't worry about that. It's meant to happen, and it'll just make that brighter area in the center stand out even more. So, as we pull back, as you can see, it does still look a little bit messy, but it's definitely starting to come together. Now, our next steps are going to be working in these little clouds here, going back, fixing up the clouds that we have up there, and doing a little bit of fine-tuning before we continue. We're now taking our 1/4" round pointed brush, making sure it's slightly damp, but I really don't want too much water on it right now. So then I'm going to take some of our purple, move that over to a previously semi-dark purple area spot here on my palette, some Mars Black, a little bit of titanium white, a little bit of blue, and the goal here is essentially to create a cloud that looks purple, but it's quite dark. It's slightly lighter than that. So, darker than this, lighter than this. Mixing those up just like that, maybe a little bit more blue. Test it on the reference photo. Again, slightly more blue. Test. I think we'll go with this one right here. So here, remember, whenever we're working on a new subject, we like to do the edges first. Trying to make sure this cloud is nice and interesting. It has these different protruding pieces that are different from one another. Now I'll go in and fill in that middle area. We also have a couple of smaller clouds that surround it. Just like that. And these are the clouds that are really going to make the piece look a lot more natural. Just having these seemingly random pieces interrupt our composition. That sort of thing generally makes a piece look a lot more real, because it doesn't look artificial. Everything doesn't look planned. When you have elements like this, I'm also going to take some of this pigment, going to apply it to the bottom of this cloud, and then I'm going to start working it down so that we get more of a softer base to this cloud. I'm now going to mix up a bit more of that purple, and we're going to continue working around the edges of our clouds. We're going to refine them, we're going to add extra little details, and we're just going to ensure that everything looks nice and clean. So I'm going to go back, first of all, do a bit more of a transition here, just because we only did a single layer and part of it was semi-transparent. This is all still fairly semi-transparent, and I do want to remedy that, but before I do that, I do want it to dry a bit more, because going over it will be significantly easier once it does. So here I'm going into the edges of this cloud. I'm creating these semi-transparent applications. You can see everything is starting to look a lot more soft. This value is, again, darker than this, brighter than this, so it acts as a nice transition. It looks like the edges of the clouds are semi-transparent, and because of that, it looks like light is moving through them, and we end up with a much more natural looking edge for this cloud. Again, one of those things we mentioned at the start of the lesson, and one of those things I was like, you know what? It's going to look good, I promise. Just stick with it. It will make sense in the end. And here we are, finally getting to that point where we can clean these things up and make them look as good as we possibly can. Well, I don't have much paint left here on my brush, and I'm just going to create a very soft, minimal cloud right here. It's good to have different densities and types of clouds to sell the realism of the piece. Just like that. Now yet again, we're going to do the same thing with this batch of clouds right here. So, take some purple, take some blue, white, a little bit of black, mix those together, make it slightly more purple. Test that in a previous area just to make sure that it's nice and cohesive. Like that a lot. So, now when we go over here, we start along the edges of these clouds, and we blend them both into and away from. Make sure that you don't just create a harsh line though, make sure that you do go back and with a very soft stroke, do a little bit of a wispy motion up into the cloud, do a little bit of a wispy motion down out of the cloud, and just keep it cycling and transitioning. I think I do want a bit more purple in this though. Maybe make it slightly brighter. Try that. Try it in a new area, just so it doesn't initially work into that and kind of dilute my A, pigment, but B, opinion of said pigment. I do like it a lot better. So I'll work that around these yet again. And if you find in the process of doing this that you actually make your cloud significantly smaller, because that can happen, don't worry about it. it's very easy to go back and add in that cloud. Here, we'll grab some Mars black, a little bit of blue, good amount of purple, hint of titanium white. And now you know what we can do? We can just repaint in our cloud. As you can see, that's a little bit darker than what we did have before. So make it a bit darker, give it slightly more saturation. Sorry, make it a little bit lighter. And there we go. That is the color of our cloud. And once we go back with this darker pigment, we can also now truly blend into that new application, which is also quite a nice opportunity because you can get some incredibly soft transitions and gradients here and really make the side of those clouds look semi-transparent. There we go. Let's head on over to here. I'm being pretty playful with my clouds right now. Really enjoying this. Quite a cathartic part of the process. I think I want to brighten up my sky a little bit, so I'm taking all of that pigment off. We'll grab some titanium white. Mix it into our purple. There we go. And just clean up any of those middle areas that may have gotten muddy or dark. Really want to connect this value in color, which I think is slightly more bright, but also slightly more gray. So I do need to add Mars black, which will darken it, but we're just using more titanium white to account for that. There we go. That's perfect. And we'll just let this dissipate as you move over to the right. Let it blend up into this cloud. Again, soft little wispy motions as you move in and out of clouds. Of course, now we have a harder line between it and the sky there. It's okay. We can go back. Being very soft with my paint right now. Now, how do we solve that? We say, what's that color? That's a blue. We have some Mars black, a little bit of purple, some titanium white, not too much. See how well that matches. Really, really well. So we can actually use this. I'll just put a good layer on top just to make it cohesive. And then I'll do a slight blend down into that new brighter purple we just applied. Now we have a soft transition. Just like that. While we're painting clouds, I'm going to take that small 1/8 round pointed brush. I'm going to grab some of that darker pigment that we were using for our clouds, and I'm just going to paint in a very tiny one right down here. It's going to be kind of visually interrupting our lightning. And again, it's just going to give us a bit more realism. It's going to create some depth, showing that the lightning is behind something. And you can see that I'm going with a pretty interesting original shape. I'm just kind of following the reference photo. It's not super dark, it's not super light, and I think that worked out really, really well. So now, yet again, we're going to take that small round pointed brush and we're going to grab some titanium white, move it to a clean spot here on our palette. Then we're going to get a slight bit of our brilliant purple. Again, you can just use a mixture of a regular blue and some red, or if you're kind of doing this the slightly easier way, you can just use whatever primary color you've been using for the actual painting. And I'm going to start painting on my lightning. So we've been wanting to do this. This is what the whole painting is leading up to. And while I do this, there are a number of techniques I'd like to talk about. But the first and most notable thing is only use the tip of your brush. Do not use the side of your brush. Do not apply any additional pressure. Make these applications as small as you possibly can. That is so vital, and that is tip number one. Because you can always make the lightning bigger. It's quite easy. You just go over the edge. Really hard to make it smaller again because you have to remix whatever color that is or whatever color that is. So go in with a very conservative approach. Like that. Now we're creating little winds, little bends, lots of different shapes, and I'm also applying the paint that I can. Then I go back, make my brush damp, grab more, and I do this a lot. I don't try to get any extra paint off of my brush. I don't, try to grind the bristles into the canvas. I use as little pressure as I can, and if that doesn't get me the application I want, then I say, okay, you know what? We'll come back. We'll get the right pigment, and then we'll work it back in there. Now I'm just looking at the reference photo here for the areas that I have covered up, because I have covered up quite a few. But here you can see we get back into the general pattern. And we're going with a bit of a purple initially, but we will be going back over it with a white. We are going to transition more into a blue. We're going to have a lot happening here, just not quite yet. It's important that we do this in stages. There we go. Again, trying to keep little movements in there, so it's not any perfectly straight lines. It's lots of little zigzags back and forth, some wide, some not. And as you get towards the end of each little lightning piece, you want it to progressively get smaller and smaller. You can also let it visually dissipate opacity-wise. There we go. Let's move the camera slightly farther down. So once I get to about this point, I do start want to working in some of our blue. Going to add some extra titanium white because the blue is a darker value than what we were working with, and we do need to compensate. This will desaturate it substantially, but that's okay. We don't want this to be saturated at all anyway. So we are still moving down here. And this area is actually quite interesting. In the photo, it's a much smaller application actually, but I left a lot of room there. So we have a couple of options. We could paint over all of this and just make a larger piece of lightning, or we could go back over it with the blue. And I think I'm going to opt to go back over it with the blue. Just because, again, I like to have much smaller lightning, especially in the beginning, and then we can expand upon it should we need to. You'll also notice that these are quite thin and transparent initially. Doesn't have that real oomph of lightning, that real flash of light, but we'll get there because, we'll get more titanium white, we'll build it up, then we'll come back into the middle of those applications and we'll reapply. And what this is going to do, it's going to make it look like it has a slight glow of that purple mixture that we had. So this mixture, this application, it's even smaller than our first one, and we're applying it in the middle of those strokes. So we're building them up, but we're letting that initial layer show through to a point. I'm going to take some titanium white, a little bit of blue, mix up that highlight, and then we'll come back down here into the middle of our lightning bolt. And as I start to get lower and lower, I'm going to start applying slightly more pressure. Still want it to be small, but I do want it to progressively get larger as we move down here. So you can see that the stroke itself is expanding. It's a little bit less delicate work, which is nice. Here we are keeping in those sporadic little movements. And again, don't really want to go over that with lightning, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at that color, that color, that color, that color. We're going to say, what's the middle ground of all of them? It's probably quite a bit of blue, a little bit of titanium white, Mars black, probably a hint of purple. Not much, but a hint for sure. And then I know that it's a much more blue than that mixture, so let's try this. First attempt, first guess. Oh. Look at that, it's so close. It's just a little bit desaturated. We'll add more blue. See how far we can move this with it staying natural. Do a little bit of a blend with it outwards. You can even kind of walk the line of the lightning. Give it a slight gradient and transition. It'll give it a little bit of a glow look. You don't have to do this with all of it, but we have an opportunity here, so we might as well have some fun. Like that. Now I look over here, I notice that these are also quite large, larger than I would like. So, yet again, I look at that, I look at that, I look at that, I look at that, I say, what's in the middle? Probably a darker version of what we currently have. Okay, matched the cloud really well. Can we expand outwards without this looking incredibly dramatic? The answer to that is no. So, we'll add some more blue, we'll add some more white. Again, this is more of a situational application. This is wholly dependent on where you may have accidentally left larger areas for lightning. And so your mixes will be different from mine, but this is essentially how I'm articulating what my mixes need to be to remedy that area and just make sure it's nice and tight for the lightning. There we go. So with that, let's take a step back and keep working on the lightning. It's good to do so up close because you can really focus on the details, but it's almost better to do it farther away because when you do that, you look at all of it at once and nothing gets overproduced in relation to anything else. So it all feels much more cohesive, where if you do, really hyper-focus on a singular area, you might make it look fantastic, but it might not fit in with the rest of the painting, and that's why painting from slightly farther away can be just, generally beneficial. So here we are, as noted, slightly farther away. We'll take some titanium white, take a little bit of blue. Maybe, and this is something to consider, once you've mixed your pigment, take off the pigment on your brush. Just wipe it off on the cloth, grab some extra water, and then go back in and grab a smaller amount of paint that you just mixed. Because when you mix paint, you build up a lot of it on the bristles, and it can be difficult to render a very sharp line with that. So, by taking it off and then just grabbing a much more minimal amount, you afford yourself significantly more control over the pigment. There we go. We do have one that kind of moves up in a fun way right over here. Accidentally applied too much pressure with my brush, as you can see. Made more of a mark than I wanted, so I'll just try to kind of scrape that paint off there. You can also quickly mix up whatever color you used for that area. Probably something quite similar to this, and paint over it. There we go. Quick and easy save. But anyways, back to our lightning. I think we were moving this down here, and you can take liberties. You can change the reference photo a little bit if you feel really inspired to. If you have a great idea you want to incorporate. Don't ever feel like you have to do exactly what it's doing. It's there to give you ideas, to make the process a little bit easier, to make sure that things are more realistic, because again, generally we simplify application subjects in our heads, and having something real to look at gives us a lot of ideas that we wouldn't naturally have incorporated. But again, don't let it feel like you're kind of handcuffed to the image it presents. You can make changes, you can make it your own, you can interject pieces of yourself, make it special. All of that is still okay. That said, I am just looking over at the reference photo as I draw these on. That way I know generally where they are. You can, of course, if you remember up over on Patreon, just retransfer it with the traceable. Or you can use the reference photo. Or you can just go back to the start of the video, see where I drew it on, and copy from that as well. There we are. Now, before I really proceed here, I thought we'd take a step back and we just mention a couple of fun little tips in regards to making lightning. And one of them, it's very similar to creating tree branches in that you never really want these little extended pieces to come off from the same horizontal point. So you see this one happens right here, then we have one below it. They're not happening at the same point. They're not making a triangle. They're not touching in that sort of way. So, you follow this down, here's a break, you follow it down, and then here is another break that way, then you continue following the main line. So you essentially have this main through line from the lightning, and then you have these little pieces that move off. And you'll also notice that while they're not moving off on the same horizontal line, they're also taking different intervals to break off. So it's not like 1, 2, 3, 4. They're not all exactly the same space apart. This is, kind of a medium width. This one is a bit of a far width. Then this is a very small one. Then we're back to another medium one, and then we don't have another one yet. So keep trying to diversify, keep trying to make it different and ever-changing. And something else I wanted to note as, we are looking at this from a bit farther away, again, we have a bit more of an opaque application, especially here in the middle. You go back, you do that over and over. But then as you start to move out, naturally your brush, your pigment is going to run out. You're going to get a more semi-transparent application. And so here, you see a lot more of the color of the sky or the clouds behind it. And you don't necessarily want to go back over all of this yet again. You can have these much more transparent, especially the ones that are farther away. So just keep those general rules in mind when you're painting it, and you'll end up with a really nice bit of lightning. Also, again, just friendly reminder, the general application is doing one application that's as small as you can make it, but with a purple or a blue, just something with a hint of color that can allude to a glow. And then you go back in with a more white mixture and you make that application even smaller than the initial one, especially in the middle, and then you don't have to do that second application all the way out when it gets really small on the edges. Just something to keep in the back of your head. But with that, let's continue this right down here. Now I'm going to use quite a bit of blue for this next application. Mix that up right there. I'm going to take that pigment off my brush so that I can make a much smaller stroke. Remember, we're not creating straight lines, so I'm kind of zigzagging a little bit, even on these longer stretches. Then it comes back in like that, and then it really expands. And again, as you get closer to the bottom, your stroke, your application can get larger. Now, this is smaller than that, but that's only because I haven't gone over it a couple of times, as we are about to do. There we go, just kind of moving back and forth. If you have a little mini line working inside these larger lines, that's also okay. That can be a nice effect. It looks like multiple little strands of lightning kind of branching off there. Here, still working with that blue as I create this base layer. And I'm having to go back a couple of times because I am now working on a much larger area of lightning. It isn't so small, so I really have to commit quite a bit of paint. There we go. Like that a lot. Make sure that it's nice and opaque. You really don't want the middle to be semi-transparent. You want it to be as opaque as possible. And now we'll grab some titanium white with just a hint of the blue. And we'll come back into the middle of it. And this application can be blended into the sides so that it looks like there's this almost white light in the middle, and then it transitions into this more blue light, which looks like the glow. But you can also just have a sharper, more white line in the middle as well, and that'll just look like miniature strands working their way sharply through the body of the lightning. And both of which can be really nice effects. You can do both on top of each other if you want. Takes a bit of extra time, but it can be a really nice detailed way of expanding upon the lightning. There we go. Starting to come together. Starting to really like it. Let's get a little bit closer for the detail work down there. So we're sticking with that same smaller round pointed brush, grabbing some of that titanium white, hint of our French ultramarine blue, mixing those together like that. And now we're going to create all of these miniature little strands that come off of it. So these are still going to be really quite small. You can expand on them if you'd like to later, but while the main body gets larger and larger as you move down, that rule doesn't apply to all of the little pieces that kind of come off like this. You still want them to be nice, delicate, sharp. All of the different things the initial applications were. Just checking my reference photo. There we go. Come up here, do another one. Maybe fill that in. As you look into the middle of this, you can see some sharper strokes as well. Do have that combination of the glow look and the sharp little applications. Mix a bit more, take that pigment off, because again, when you mix, you create a lot of pigment on that bristle. You don't necessarily want that. go. Splitting it a couple of times. And it's these really tiny ones that are going to sell your lightning and make it look as good as it possibly can. I'm also occasionally going over top other ones and having them crisscross, because they aren't just moving out left to right, they're moving front, back, all of these interesting directions. Here I am expanding one of them. I'll also expand this one. Now as we step back, something I'd really like you to take note of is this area right here. You can see that there is that brighter blue right behind our lightning, and it really makes it look like a good glow for our lightning. So we're creating lightning and our glow for it in two different ways. One with the background colors and values, and two with the fact that we applied it in two different applications, and the middle one was brighter than the outskirts one, which had a bit more of a hue to it. So when we look at this and we look up here, it starts to make sense as to why we were dancing around different hues and values in the background, why this area is a bit darker, farther away from the lightning, why this area is supposed to be a bit darker, again, farther away from the lightning. But you'll also notice that right along the edges of it, it actually is fairly dark. Now, that's a bit of a stylistic choice you can make, because the darker that is, the more this is going to pop, because they're just much more stark values. It really gives a good pop to that main subject. But you can also add a bit more of a glow to that area by doing what you did down here and just adding more of that light right along the edges of this. Now again, I didn't opt to do that because I wanted to show you two different ways of going about it. I think both of which can be quite interesting, but should you want to do it the other way, I do want to quickly show you how we can do that as well. So with the 1/4 inch round pointed brush, I'm going to make sure it's nice and damp. I'm going to mix up some blue that's fairly similar to that, so we'll take some titanium white, a little bit of our cerulean blue, hint of our Mars black, not much at all. Definitely want more of our blue and white in this mixture than anything else. Like that. We'll give that a test down here. And as you can see, we got really lucky yet again, and it's pretty perfect. So now we can take this and work it along the edges of our lightning, just like so. And then when you start to run out of paint, go back over the edges that you just created and create a very soft blend and transition into that darker area that we've previously applied. And this is going to, yet again, create an extra layer of glow. Because this layer is fully dry, this is best achieved when your brush is moderately damp, as you'll get semi-transparent applications that show through. Of course, when your brush is quite damp, you end up with quite a bit of a reflective quality to that application. So you're not going to see it perfectly initially because the reflection is going to make it look brighter. You can also take your finger, soften that so there's just less water, so you can see that transition a little bit quicker. Just something else to try, have fun with. And this is the more natural way of having it kind of visually present itself, but it's okay to take artistic liberties. It's okay to, keep a darker background like we did initially, just because it does visually pop more. And I think when people think of lightning, that's what they think of. So it's really up to you what you want to do with it. But now at least you have the decision and the opportunity to make it. There we go. Had we painted this area on both the left and the right hand side of the lightning like this initially, we wouldn't really have this option. We would in that we could, walk this over towards the lightning, but this is a much more clean process because if you accidentally move over the lightning with this pigment, it just looks like more of the glow and it's just a very natural visual. You don't risk a lot with it. And I'm also moving it out slightly on some of the larger arms. Here I'm coming back in with just water, so I can move it about quite easily. Use my finger to soften that edge again. But I really like what we're accomplishing here. As you do this, you may need to switch back to the smaller round pointed brush though, the one that's about 1/4 of an inch, or rather 1/8 of an inch. Create more of that really bright middle blue that we used for the lightning. And go over that because again, if you do accidentally go over the middle of this, with that you do darken it a bit, which is okay because it's such an easy fix, but just something to keep in mind. So here we're going back, we're sharpening, we're making brighter, we're maintaining a clean look. And now, I do want a couple more little arms. We're not going to overdo it, and we're going to make sure that this is the main target area. And yet again, there goes my water bottle. I think I may need a slightly better place to put it. I don't know about you, but as a painter, I find that, and I think actually a lot of us can attest to this, when you keep coffee or a drink, an open drink near your painting studio, your area, you can accidentally dip your brush into it as opposed to your little dish of water for painting. And I think some of us have actually had a drink from that afterwards. So, as an artist, as someone who did go to university for art, I would hear about that happening all the time. I think it's happened to me once before. So I switched to a water bottle, which I now keep by my feet just because I like to have my reference photo, my water, all of my paints, my different brushes, everything else up here, and I keep forgetting about it. Which is not a good thing for a couple of reasons. One, because we need to stay hydrated. That's important. But two, it does make a bit of an obstruction in the audio as we go. So I don't know. We'll find a new spot though. We will do that. With that said, while we're on kind of a lighter, more goofy note, I would like to take a little break from talking technique and just say a big thank you to you for stopping by, for taking the time to learn as much as you are. I know that we are quite far in the lesson at this point, and it did go through some messy stages, so good for you for, really pushing on through and, putting in the time and the effort to get this far. I think that really deserves a lot of respect. I love it when people are willing to get as good at something as they possibly can and put in that time. So if you watch this channel, then you know that I like to come up with little secret words, little code words you can leave in the comments. You can incorporate in sentences just to know that you did get quite far. And, I will know, everybody else who got this far will know, and it'll be a little badge of honor. So today the word is illuminate. You can work that into a sentence, or you can just post it in the comments. But by doing so, I will know that you were one of the dedicated few who was willing to really stick it out and learn as much as you could. There we go. Getting really small with these applications right now. Applying as little pressure as I can and letting that pigment dissipate from the brush, allowing it to get darker, or rather just more transparent. Speaking of getting darker, did you see that? Cloud just moved over the sky. Wow. Always need to see the painting in a different light. Now you can see that as I moved up here, we incorporated that glow, but at this point, I essentially stopped, and it's quite noticeable right here. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add more of that glow. This time, we'll do so a bit closer so you have a bit of a better view. And again, I always try to show similar techniques from different distances. That way you can see what it looks like from a very detailed point of view, and you can also see what it looks like in context with the rest of the painting. I think both of which offer very different information visually, and it's good to do. So now we're going to go back and we're going to do the rest of that glow. So I'm trying to remix this color that we have right here. Now I need to make it slightly more saturated, so I'll just add in a hint more blue, and that looks like what we need. Now I'll take that extra pigment off my brush. We'll grab that right there, and we'll head into those edges. With that said, I would also like to take a little bit of time here to say a big thank you to everyone who supports the channel up over on Patreon. This channel is primarily fan-funded, and these lessons, quite simply, happen because of you. I would not have the time to make these each week without your support. I'd be busy doing a different job, and maybe we'd get one of these out a month, but because of you, we get to get these out as frequently as we do. I think last week was the first week I actually missed in maybe 3 years. Amazing to note. Don't think I've actually taken a week off in 3 years. And it's not because I feel like I need to work, it's because I love it, and it's a lot of fun. And I also didn't take last week off. I just didn't end up with a painting that I loved, and I never want to put out a painting that I feel is subpar or will kind of lead you in the wrong direction, because sometimes you do a painting or you do a lesson and it's like, well, the end result was good, but was the way we got there the right way? And I feel like I always have to ask myself that, and if the answer is no, then I redo the lesson or I pick a different image and do a different lesson. But last week I just didn't feel like I came to a place of something that I loved. And it's because of you, again, up over on Patreon, that I can do that I don't have to put out every lesson I make, that I can make sure that, we're redoing them, we're doing the good ones, and we're making sure that we're learning different things, and that it's consistently as good of quality as I can make. So thank you. Thank you for providing me with that opportunity. Thank you for making this community what it is. Thank you for providing these lessons for everybody else who, can't afford traditional art training. You make all of this happen. It's incredibly generous of you. And again, I like to say it in every video. I'd like to say it multiple times in every video, but don't want to annoy everyone. But just know that I am incredibly grateful for you and all that you do here for me and everybody else who watches the channel. With that said, if you are new here, I know there are a lot of new people from the campfire lesson. I do have a Patreon. Up there we have things like the traceables, the reference photos. I also have 5 ebooks, including that of Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. In it we talk about how to blend colors, how to work with water, what brushes to use, composition, all of that good stuff. I also have a couple books of traceables for the uninspired days. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where we all kind of share artwork, help each other out, give each other ideas. I also do personalized critiques at higher tiers as well. So there's a lot of really fun things up over on Patreon. Also have some bonus lessons. So if you haven't already, I'd recommend going and checking it out. I do have a link to it in the description. And again, it is essentially what keeps this channel running, keeps those lights on, quite literally, how we pay the bills. And I say we, I suppose that is the royal we, not a company, just an individual trying to make some great art, trying to make some great art lessons, and build a community who also really appreciates that. So again, go check it out if you haven't already. A lot of really neat things up there. And again, big thank you to all of the patrons who do make these lessons happen as frequently as you do. And again, big thank you for nobody complaining that there wasn't a lesson last week. Again, I think it's the first week in 3 years that I haven't had one. And I did try. I just want to make sure everything I put out for you is really, really good quality. There we go. With that said, the polls that we currently have up on Patreon are going quite well. Neat to see all of your ideas and the lessons you'll be working on in the future. This one actually was in the poll, and it didn't win, but I had this idea of adding an ocean underneath it, and I had to do it immediately. Felt inspired, I felt a rush, and it was, okay, you know what, we need to create that. So, already having an impact on the channel and the lessons. And while it didn't win, I think it was in second place on one of the polls. So, still a highly voted for lesson. Here right now I'm trying to crisscross a lot of these. Give them some extra depth. Just like branches, you really do want them moving in front of each other. And something I don't think a lot of people do, but it looks really good. Find little areas and do this with just a couple of them. Have the lightning move back up. I think in a lot of paintings of lightning, the lightning's consistently moving down, but there are going to be areas and examples where it should kind of wrap back up that way. It's a little thing, they're incredibly small and subtle, but I think it makes a big difference. Now, because we did go back over the edges, I am going back into the middle now and re-brightening those areas, because again, they do get slightly diluted. There we go. Really love what this is turning into. Took some time, but I think it was worth it. So here we have our lightning, we have our glow from the lightning, and then we have a sky that has a variety of different colors. A purple that's essentially moving this way down into this lightning, which we are about to do, but some also sharp clouds here, softer clouds here, incredibly soft clouds here, a mixture of both with a lot of different intricate shapes, and then again, another type of cloud. So we actually have a lot going on. I know, like, initially you look at this and you say, oh, it's lightning in a little bit of a storm. Yes, but there is a lot of subtlety in hue, there is a lot of subtlety in the variation of clouds, and there is a lot of intricate movement in here. So if you haven't started yet, I would implore you to take your time and recognize that if it isn't going perfectly immediately, just go back, rewatch that portion of the lesson, do another layer on the painting, because it is a type of painting, for sure, that requires a lot of layers, and that just gets better and better the more you commit to it. So with that said, we are now going to head down into this area, and when I say this area, I mean this area because we still need to paint that lightning. So this lightning right here, it's much farther away and it has much more of this foggy purple look on top of it. So what we're going to do, we're actually not going to go with a pure titanium white or a lot of titanium white and a lot of blue. We're going to go with an almost even mixture of our brilliant purple and our titanium white. So we'll mix those two up right here, take off the excess, make the brush nice and damp, grab that. And I'm actually going to start kind of in the middle of this lightning, which is a little bit different from what we've been doing, but I want an area that I can be fairly confident and consistent with for my first application, because the top of it needs to be incredibly subtle and it essentially disappears up into the sky, and the bottom is a bit larger. So the middle is something consistent, something we can practice with, get our comfort level there, and then once we start trying to paint and our applications are semi-transparent, we'll move upwards with it, lessening pressure until it dissipates and essentially turns into nothing. You can also take your finger and soften it even further, but because it's so much farther away, you don't see all of these additional movements, and it's kind of just this really beautiful, subtle detail in the bottom left-hand side of the painting, which really balances this because the majority of it is on the right-hand side of the painting. So now I'm just going back in, doing one more layer here for the bottom with a purplish white. It's going to look a little bit brighter this time because we are building on top of a lighter layer as opposed to a darker layer. And acrylics are semi-transparent, so you do see that layer underneath whatever you're currently working on. And just like that, we have some nice distant lightning. So now we're going to begin working on the ocean, and I'm going to do so with this 1-inch large flat-headed brush. And I'm going to do that because it has a nice sharp edge to render the horizon line with, and because it is such a large body, it can really pick up a lot of paint. With that said, I'm going to take some of my not cerulean blue, we're using French ultramarine blue. Generally, we use cerulean blue because it leans a little bit more towards green. It's a bit more of a cool blue, and so it's great for daytime skies, that sort of thing. Where this is ultramarine blue, it leans more towards purple. So it's great when you're already using purple in a painting as they work very cohesively together. They look much more similar. They blend much better with red. So if you're ever looking for something to be a true purple or work really well in conjunction with it, then this is a great blue to choose. I generally use the cerulean blue though because it makes my purples a bit more subtle. And in nature, generally the purples are a bit more subtle. But I thought for this one, we would really accentuate those purples and make them just really, really gorgeous. With that said, here I am mixing a medium to dark blue, like what we have in the sky. Going to, first of all, work my horizon line. And I'm doing a series of strokes. Ask yourself, why am I doing that? I mentioned this earlier in the lesson. Suppose this is a little quiz, little pop quiz. Don't stress though, I will tell you the answer. Just think about it. Why am I making a myriad of horizontal strokes as opposed to one larger, longer one? The answer is that when you make a longer stroke, and I'll do it right here just for an example, you tend to move either up or down one way or the other, and the best way to get a consistent stroke is through a series of them. It's also beneficial because if you start to run out of paint, it's very easy to notice, and you can quickly go back and grab more and continue, where when you're doing this, eventually it might trail off, and then you kind of have to find that stroke again to complete it in a similar way. Once I have that edge, I am going to start moving inwards. And right now you can see that it is semi-transparent. I do have a bit of water on my brush, and I'm actually going to do this with as dry of a brush as I possibly can. So I'm cleaning it, I'm just wiping it on some paper towel until it's essentially dry, and now I'm going to go back and grab and mix more paint. Now because my brush isn't really damp anymore, I'm not going to be able to keep my paint wet for as long as I was able to, and I'm not going to be able to drag it as far as I was able to, but I'll probably be able to create a base layer with a single application as opposed to multiple layers. We're going to add a lot more detail to this water, but right now I'm just giving it a base layer of this darker blue. And if you find that some portions of your horizon aren't perfectly straight, you can always go back to them. You can also put down green painter's tape and then paint over it. A lot of great options. I'll probably go back and fine-tune mine a little bit later, but it's one of those things where you kind of need to paint on a bit of an angle, and because I have my camera out, that is an angle I find I consistently struggle with kind of moving into, otherwise I really block the shot. With that said, as we start to move out further, I'm going to make this brighter and more saturated. So, more blue, more titanium white. just like that. Now I'll blend that back into our darker bluish gray, using very soft applications so it isn't full of streaks and strokes. Now I'm going to switch over to my smaller round pointed brush, this one right here. I'm going to grab quite a bit of my titanium white, hint of our blue, create a nice bright blue, and now we're going to create some waves. So I'm going to start on the edge here, and then I'm going to start working them in. Now, the waves are coming in like this, but you're going to see them trail off horizontally. Now, I want them to be much brighter than this in the end, but this is essentially going to give me a good map and allow me to build them out over multiple layers, which will give us a lot more depth. If you wait for this to dry, it'll be a lot easier, but again, you'll get less soft transitionary layers. So it's really a preferential thing, how you want to tackle it. So we are going to have some real waves there, and then I'm going to do a couple little pitter-patter strokes as you move off into the distance. Create some separation in there. This will be a nice bright wave. Blending it back into that blue. This is another process that initially isn't going to look amazing, but we'll get it there. Just have to keep going, just have to have faith. We'll figure it out. There we are. Now we have a wave here that's kind of crashing and it moves in this arch. So I'll create that arch, doing this little pitter-patter, leaving darker spots in between. And I know I'm painting this from far away, so it's a little difficult for you to see the detail probably, but I think that's honestly for the best. Here, you're not looking for an insane amount of detail because we have such a small area that you literally can't fit all that detail. But what's important is a progression of changing applications and movements. And that's what you can really articulate when, again, painting from farther away. And you're looking at it from farther away because, again, my camera is farther away. But you can also paint from farther away by holding your brush like this and then going to the end of it and doing that. So now I'm going back over portions of the wave, making it brighter. There we go. Really nice. Continuously washing my brush in between each application because every time I go and I apply paint, I pick up some of this darker paint, and that's difficult to work with. Now I'm going to continue this wave that's washing up. And again, I start with more of that highlight on the bottom, and then it moves into more of a spaced out pitter-patter as you move up higher. And that's kind of the transition from the almost white into the blue. So almost white into blue, and then here on top, a lot of very small horizontal strokes which start with very minimal pressure, apply more pressure, and then end with minimal pressure. And the changing of pressures is going to make the start of the application, oh my, look a little bit softer, look a little more semi-transparent, and the middle is going to be much more opaque, and then the end of it that'll be more semi-transparent again. Now, between me accidentally knocking my water bottle twice this episode and knocking the easel twice this episode, I think we can see what happens when we paint without coffee. I think that's what it is. I think we know the importance of coffee in painting. A true staple of most artists. For those of you who can do this without coffee, I am in awe of you. I think that is an incredible ability that you have. And I think I should probably go make some coffee after this. Here you can see we are continuing that wave effect despite having coffee. That's right. Impressive, I know. There we go. Now, this right here, I actually want to get it to a very similar value as the lighting, but if I were to continuously throw paint on this right now, it'd be very difficult to get it to that because this is still wet. It still has these Mars blacks and all of these other darker diluted pigments in them. And so getting it to a pigment like that while it's wet, very difficult. So I'm actually going to let that dry before we continue with that area. And instead, we're going to leave it, let it be a little messy for a while. We're going to work on the sand here, then we'll work on the transition area, then we'll work on that right there. So for the sand, we actually are going to use some Mars black, a little bit of blue, a little bit of purple, a little bit of white. Why is our sand not brown or a golden color? Because it's very dark and it has the reflective colors of all that is around it. We have a lot of purples and blues bouncing off of it right now. It's very wet. And that's why it's going to be this darker bluish gray, almost reminiscent of a black. But if we added an actual black to the canvas, you would see that it really isn't a black, that it does have some hue in it, and that it is a bit brighter. There we go. Tested on my reference photo. Looks good. Actually really what I want. That's great. Feel a little guilty sometimes when I test things on the reference photo and it just works because it's like it isn't always that easy. I promise you. Sometimes I go back 3 or 4 times and I wouldn't say fuss over it, but I get pretty meticulous. So if you are testing on the reference photo, just trying to get that color exactly right, recognize that it really can take time. Sometimes we get lucky, sometimes we don't. So, there we have our sand. Now we are going to switch to another brush. This is the 1/2 inch flathead brush. Essentially just a smaller version of what we were using. I'll grab some blue, move that to a clean spot. I'll grab a little bit of what we were using and some titanium white. Make it a bit brighter. And we're painting a very thin layer of water washing up on the shore. I'm going to test this on my photo. Okay, that one didn't work as well. It needs to be more saturated. Good. There we go. Friendly reminder, it doesn't always work the first time. This will be good for the base, actually. So here I'm okay with going over this because I know I need to go back in and lighten that base anyway. And I'm also okay with getting a slight blend into the sand as well. So I'm not aiming for the sharpest of applications, but I do want it to retain form. There we go. If you feel like you need to expand on the sand or the water, you can do that. Right now we are just blocking in the sand, we are just blocking in this thin little bit of water that's washing up on it. And in the distance here, I'm going to do a bit more of a blend between the two. So you can see I'm working them back and forth into each other, where I didn't do that with this. This is a bit sharper. It still has a slight blend, but it's just minimal along the edge, where this is a true blend from one into the other. So it's been about 5 minutes, and a couple of really great things have occurred. The first, the paint is now dry, so we can go over top this with some real details and highlights. The second is that the sun came out, so yet again, this looks a little bit brighter. And the third is that I got some coffee, and I am feeling great. You know, I don't really take sponsorships for the channel just because I really don't want anything like that kind of having an effect on my opinion of a product or what I tell you I use. I always want to just be as transparent with you as possible, and I don't have to take sponsorships because of the wonderful people over on Patreon. But if I were to get a sponsorship, I don't think it should be for an art product. I really think it should be for some type of coffee, just because it makes a world of difference for me and my painting. With that said, here we are going back and we're heading more towards this center area of the wave with a slightly lighter bluish white. I'm creating this pitter patter, and all of these strokes, as you can see, I'll do a couple more, they're in this direction. They have slight spaces in between. All of those spaces are of course different from the one that we created last. And then I pick a couple of them and I move them back with a bit of a tap, again skipping little areas. Occasionally we'll combine a couple of them, like that. And it looks like the wave, it looks like some foam. It's a lot of detail happening. We can also make sure that we continue that edge, like that. And then we'll start it up again over here. Make sure that's nice and bright as it rolls up onto the beach. We'll also take that with a hint of extra blue and a hint of extra Mars black. And we'll create some of these a bit farther out here to the right hand side. I don't want them as bright as what we have there, but I do want them to be brighter than the base. And here you can see we have one that's there, another one right here. This one's longer than this one, and it's also farther to the right. So again, diversity. We can also blend these off and make them more transparent as they move towards the right. It'll make it sink into the rest of the painting in the water quite well. And I'm trying to keep this area as the brightest area because it's going to get a direct reflection of light from the lightning. There we go. I think we'll mix up a bit of what we have here, but make it slightly brighter. Blue, white, little bit of black. I think that's close. We'll give it a try. Looks like it. And we'll just do that again right under this main area, and we'll let it dissipate and run out as you move towards the left and the right. You can also leave a slight area of slightly darker blue right between this and that transition. That way it looks like you have a bit of a shadow from that wave. It's a little detail, but it goes a long way. So as we step back, you can see that it really is starting to come together, but we're not quite there yet. So I'm going to make more of the blue that we had in there, because I do feel like that initial layer was a little thin, and it is semi-transparent, and it's the only area right now really in the water and the sand where you can see that semi-transparent application, that grid of the canvas, and it's kind of conflicting with the general aesthetic of the piece. So, let's just work that here. It's a bit more gray because we're a little bit farther away. I don't want it to pop as much as the foreground. But as I move towards the foreground, we will take more blue, interject that, make it more saturated. And of course, blue is a darker value, so I'll have to compensate with white, which will yet again desaturate it, so then we'll add more blue. And we're essentially just working the pigment farther away from Mars Black. That should do it. And normally, when I do all of that mixing, I do like to take the paint off my brush. But because we're not really dealing with anything hyper detailed here, I think it is okay to keep what we have on there. So you can see that this connects into this, which connects into this, and you can see that this connects into this, which connects into this. So we kind of have two different areas of water. We'll get a little bit more of the white, brighten up that mixture so it has a highlighted version as well. And you know what, I might just tap some really small applications right under the lightning so it looks like little bubbles, little highlights off rocks and shells and all of that. Just an extra little detail in here. Don't need too many of them, but it's a nice addition. There we go. I think I might want to straighten that up a little bit. There. And as we go back over to this edge, again, I don't want it to be as bright as that. I want it to look like it's getting farther away. I want it to, really dissipate. But you can add a little bit of detail with the implication of waves in the same way we did these, but just with a darker bluish gray. And make sure that it all has these nice thick applications. You can also take that and move it really far back over here as well. And it'll add some extra depth. So as we step back, we can see the entirety of our painting. We can see the lightning, the clouds, the water, and I have to say, I love how this all came together. I know that in the beginning it looked a little rough, but stepping back now and seeing it, it was worth it. We made something special. And it's a great reminder to have patience. It's a great reminder to, have faith in your vision and in your goal. And it's a great lesson for just so much more than painting. But it's really something that, this lesson, it's really something that tests that really instills that in you. So I think there's a lot to be taken away from this painting, both in terms of technical technique and just general ways of living your life. But with that said, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you for making it this far. I think it's amazing just how many people do that. And again, don't forget to use the keyword, which I believe was illuminate, in the comment section. Look at how we illuminated that water right there. There's a way of doing it. But with that said, really, really thank you for joining me. Thank you to all of the patrons for, really making this happen. It is because of you that I can try to do multiple painting lessons each and every week and do something that I really am proud of and make you guys the best lessons I possibly can. I feel like this is something I've wanted to do for quite some time, and I feel like we did it. We did a great job. So remember, enjoy the process. Recognize that you are going to have to do a lot of layering to get it the way you want. If you do get really frustrated, recognize that you don't have to do the combination of the purples and the blues. You can go with one or the other and it will still turn into a really nice painting. This is just for those of you who do want to have more of an advanced painting, more of an advanced lesson, and really test yourself, but it really isn't necessary. And again, thank you for joining. If you are thinking about joining Patreon, remember, up there you can get the traceable, the reference photo, access to our exclusive Facebook group, all 5 of my ebooks, a bunch of bonus lessons, individual art critiques, a bunch of really fun things, so go check that out. And again, to our patrons, thank you. I know this is probably the 3rd time I've said this video, but I mean it, and I want to say it 50 more times, because it's incredible what you do for me, for this community as a whole, for everybody else who watches these videos, because you provide these for everybody else. And I'd like to say a big thank you. So with that said, I will see you next week with a brand new painting lesson, probably something that was voted for up over on Patreon. And I really look forward to seeing everybody's renditions of this one. Much like the campfire, I'm sure there are going to be a lot of them. I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of really fantastic ideas added onto it. And I look forward to seeing your personal touches, your little signatures on it as well. I think that's always a really exciting part of the process. So again, enjoy the process, stay creative. If you keep kicking your water bottle over, maybe make some coffee and wake up a little bit. But with that said, again, thank you for joining me. I will talk to you soon. And above all, as always, stay creative.